All right, so again, if you are absent or you need a refresher on today's notes, make sure that you take care of your warm-ups. Okay, so we're honestly just going to jump right into it. I'm not going to play this video for you, but feel free to take some time and watch it on your own. It is really great, informative, and not super duper long, but it will kind of help explain everything that we're literally about to look over. Okay, so elements of art are basically things that you see in just about every single type of artwork, whether that's the main focal point of the piece or not. So, for instance, line is one of the elements. So, line is an element of art that is essentially mark making. So, you have to think like when you pick up a pencil and you start making line or you start drawing on your paper, you're creating lines. And so it's the simplest form of art, whether that's even with a paintbrush, everything that's two-dimensional essentially comes from creating lines, okay? Now we've done some types of lines with projects throughout the school year. So if we look at some of the work we've done, we did the blind contour drawings, continuous line drawings. Those were fun days where we got to kind of draw under the table. Then we had our most recent project with the line variation, ends and tangles and patterns and all that fun stuff. This is not a project we necessarily did per se. We did a version of it in our sketchbook, but this is what my kids did last year. But it is essentially what you did. So, of course, we had the linear lines going towards the vanishing dot. And so it is creating a line, a visual line with your eyes. So it's all going to one dot. So therefore, that's a form of line. It's implied. And then we did our cross hatching, hatching, and stippling, the 3 different types of shading with ink. And of course, you have to use lines when you're doing at least the hatching and cross hatching. And then quite a throwback with our portfolios. We had to consider the different thickness and thinness of our lines in order to get the layering correct for our neon sign portfolios. So, that one, it was more fine motor, making sure you were holding the paintbrush correctly to get those fine lines. But these are just some examples that we have used throughout the year. Okay, the next element is shape. This element of art is typically two-dimensional flat or limited to height and width. And so some examples is when we went to the computer lab and we literally just use a bunch of shapes to create an image. And we used a variety of shape sizes and, a bunch of other types of things we're going to talk about in a second. But that was very much focused on shapes and how shapes can create an image. We also did our Roy Lichtenstein paper relief project very early on in the year, where we had to physically cut out shapes and place them on top of each other to create the layered effect, the popping effect, but more importantly, the collage effect. So that was definitely using shapes. And then, again, a version of what we did was in our sketchbooks, but we talked about the different types of shapes. Typically, we were looking at the geometric because they had flat edges, and so it was easier to connect them to the vanishing point. So these are some ways that we used shape throughout the year. Now, essentially the opposite of shape, or maybe not so much the opposite, but the more advanced version of shape would be form. So this element of art is three-dimensional and encloses volume. An example would be, spheres, cubes, cones, and cylinders. And of course, there's more. Typically, when we think of forms, we think of actual physical things like sculptures, clay, those types of things. But of course, you can draw things that have depth and create that element of 3D. But when we look at some of the things we did this year, I'm going to just focus on the more three-dimensional aspect. So there were 2 types of projects that focused on form using different materials. We used cardstock and felt to create our felt food sculptures. And then, of course, we used clay to create our animal pinch pot pencil holders. So those are 2 different types of ways that we created a 3-dimensional piece of artwork. Now the fun one, the important one. Value is the lightness and darkness of a color. This can also be known as a gradient. You know, when we typically start new mediums, I always want you to do a value scale, and we all know it's the lightness and darkness, which is dependent on your hand pressure. So looking at some of the things we've done this year, again, going back to our portfolios, we talked about tints, tones, and shades. So when you're wanting to create a darker color, you add black. When you want it to be a bit lighter, you add white. And so those are ways that you create the darkness and lightness. We did our cubes. But the main project we did with value were our value pumpkins with charcoal. And then, of course, our pop art illusion color pencil shading project. But these are all ways that we were creating different types of values, whether that was creating depth or physically mixing paint, because mixing paint is a different type of value. Space. This element of art is defined by the positive and negative areas within an art piece. Depth is also achieved in this element. So things that we've talked about are our positive and negative space projects we just recently finished with our animal silhouettes. So here, for example, where my mouse is with the kangaroo example, the positive space would be the background. But if we go down here, the kangaroo would be the positive space. So those are types of, positive, negative space when it comes to what your eye focuses on. And then these two are more or less examples of how we filled the space. So our portfolios really challenged y'all to draw really, really, really big, especially since we had just finished our zines prior to this. So we went from really tiny to really big. And then, of course, this is just like a representation of all of your sketchbook assignments, filling the space and filling the area and not having everything on the horizon line, all that great type of depth that I was wanting to see. And then beyond just the color aspect of this project that we know we really focused on, we also talked about balance and how to create a balanced composition, different types of symmetry, asymmetrical and symmetrical were the two ones we focused on. So being able to create that is a sense of space in a way. So these are all different ways that we incorporated space throughout the year. You got texture. This is one of my favorites. This element of art refers to how something feels if you were to touch it. 2D texture is referred to as implied. 3D texture is referred to as actual. So if we were to look at these two pieces of art off to the side, these specific examples would be considered implied because there is that soft element of water and the softness from the grass and the trees and clouds, but we can't actually touch this piece and feel that. But it's implied by the way that the paint strokes were created. Now, this is an actual sculpture, so it would be actual texture. So therefore, if we were to physically touch it, we could get that experience of, oh, okay, this is actually smoother. This is like got that glossy. I can tell you from experience, this is not actually wet. It might look it, but it's actually very smooth. Some things that we had going on for those that were able to achieve texture with your digital projects, that was awesome. Not necessarily a requirement, but a lot of y'all did that, and that was great. And then when we did our technique week, we did our hands with the texture fingers. And then this is an example of actual texture. So if I were to actually touch this project, I could feel the softness of the little quote-unquote noodles, aka yarn, and just the overall feel that it is soft, except for where she cut the straws to create the little, I don't know what they're called off the top of my head, but those actually would be more on the hard plastic side. And color. This element of art is made up of three properties: hue, value, and intensity, known as saturation. And again, it's not just knowing the colors, but how to actually use the colors accurately in your own work of art. So we've obviously done a ton of projects with color and assignments, but just to name a few, we did the Roy Lichtenstein again. That was focusing on contrast, but also being challenged by just using the primary colors as well as yellow, or sorry, not in color, including black and white. With our positive and negative space, when we did our backgrounds, we had to choose a specific color scheme and accurately depict that with our abstract straw design. Then we had the fun, almost, it felt like a bingo hall in my classroom where we were like, I got a yellow, I got an orange, and we were running around helping each other. It was really fun watching y'all do this one. But when we had to kind of cut up magazines and find different colors that went with the specific assigned color group that you got, that was definitely utilizing color. The sketchbook assignment where we had to start with an original, design or photo or whatever, and then you simplified it by using just the complementary colors. And then, of course, the biggest project the entire school year that focuses on color was our medieval oil pastels, because it wasn't just a matter of, oh, I know what the secondary colors are, I know what the primary colors are. It's a matter of, okay, this color will not pop on this color. How can I layer it? What colors will go well with each other? And being able to plan out color selection, because it's really, really, really important that you know how to use the information that you're given and not just memorize it, because memorizing things in art is essentially pointless. And again, I'm not going to be showing this video in this particular presentation. Feel free to go and find it and watch it yourself. But we are not really going to focus too much on the principles of art in Art 1. However, it's not any new information. Again, it's things that you have seen throughout the whole school year within all of your projects. But again, it's not something we're going to super duper focus on. But I did show the video in class and kind of talked about it. But it is important that you're familiar with them for next year for those taking Art 2. And again, if you're absent, I will have a digital copy of the worksheet placed underneath this video so you can print it and work on it. And that will be due either when you get back or, we can work on that. But it's essentially just a work day for the rest of this class period. If you have any questions about the worksheet, feel free to let me know, because there are some areas that might be a little tricky, especially the section with space. And I would be more than happy to walk you through that one. So again, reread the slides, make sure you look over everything, and if you have any questions, let me know.